tell us more about what Georgia's doing.
So I told this story in a recent piece of mine, which is there's a rural county in Georgia called Hancock County. It's about 100 miles southeast of Atlanta. And there was a mayoral election in the county seat of Sparta, which has about 1,000 people, and it's 90% Black. Now, through a weird series of circumstances, the Board of Elections in Hancock County, which is a majority Black county, was majority white. And white members of the Board of Elections tried to remove Black voters from the rolls in advance of this mayoral election. And they tried to challenge the registrations of 20% of Black voters in this county seat of Sparta. And they sent police to serve them summons saying they had to appear at the Board of Elections hearing or they would be removed from the rolls, which is a very, very intimidating tactic. And what happened was that a lot of people were removed from the rolls in this majority Black county, in this majority Black city. A white mayor was elected for the first time in 32 years in the town of Sparta, and voter participation declined by 40%. Now, the reason I told this story in my new article was that the county attorney for Hancock County, who defended this voter purge, is a guy by the name of Barry Fleming. He's a state representative. He is now chair of a special committee on election integrity in Georgia that the Speaker of the House set up to put in place all of this restrictive registration. So the guy that was in charge of purging Black voters in Georgia is now going to be the guy in charge of quote unquote election integrity in the state. And that's the kind of thing we're dealing with here. And the proposals that Georgia is talking about, we'll see what actually passes, but the proposals they're talking about, getting rid of automatic registration, getting rid of no excuse absentee voting, getting rid of ballot drop boxes, getting rid of the ability of third-party groups to send voter registration materials, preventing people who move to the state in November from voting in a runoff in January, which makes absolutely no sense because they're residents of the state. These are huge changes to the process at a time when Georgia had record turnout in 2020, and of course, flipped for Joe Biden for the first time they voted for a Democrat in 30 years, and elected 2 Democrats to the Senate, 1 Black, 1 Jewish. First Black member of the Senate from Georgia, first Jewish member to the Senate in Georgia at a time when Black turnout was higher than it had ever been before. So this, with an election which the Secretary of State, the Republican Secretary of State, said over and over and over to Donald Trump, there was zero evidence of fraud. They had 3 recounts in Georgia, and they had 0 evidence of fraud. So, I mean, it's really the best test case for what happened in 2020. There was record voter turnout. There was no problems, unlike past elections in Georgia. And then the minute that happens, the first thing Republicans do is turn around and say, we're going to target all the methods that led to this record turnout.
Let's move, because Georgia obviously is not the only place where Republicans are doing this. Arizona. You've got Republican state legislatures.
Arizona's crazy. I mean, of course, remember, this is the state that just censured Cindy McCain, just censured the Republican governor of the state. So it's a crazy time there. The Arizona legislature has introduced 34 bills to make it harder to vote, which is such an crazy number to introduce so far, and it runs the whole gamut. They're talking, like in Georgia, they're talking about getting.
I don't mean to interrupt you. How many bills could they have introduced? Period. Since that time, like, I mean, this is the thing that I feel like Republicans understand in a way that Democrats never seem to understand. Their job number one when they get into office. I mean, if they have introduced that many bills, and maybe it's possible that's only a fraction of the bills. Maybe they've introduced 1,000 bills. I don't think so. But they get in, and their job number one is, what can we change legislatively to enhance our ability to maintain our power? Period. End of story. The idea that there is a broad constituency out there for, like, when you guys get in office, I want to make sure that you guys are making sure that the electorate is 7/10 the size that it is now. You know, like no, that they do this. It's amazing to me.
Yeah, I mean, when Republicans get in power, the first thing they think about is how can we abuse power to prevent the other party from ever getting in power. And when Democrats take power, they just make all of these excuses why they can't exercise the power that they actually have. And so I mean, it really, I mean, what's happening, what Democrats are doing in the U.S. Senate by refusing to get rid of the filibuster, and what Republicans are doing in states like Georgia and Arizona could not be any starker in terms of how they view the power they have. But so the kind of things they're doing in Georgia, they're trying to get rid of mail voting. They're trying to eliminate this list or purge hundreds of thousands of voters from a list of who automatically receives mail ballots. Arizona is a state where 80% of people vote by mail. So 3.2 million voters are on a list of people that get absentee ballots every single election. And they want to get rid of that list or pare it back significantly. The craziest proposal, well, there's two other proposals. So they have all these laws that target mail voting. Then they have a law that says you can only have a certain number of polling places. So at the same time, they're trying to get rid of mail voting. They're also basically saying we're going to make it really hard to vote in person too. So under one proposal, Maricopa County, the largest county in the state, which flipped for Joe Biden, they, instead of being able to have 100 polling places, would only be able to have 15 polling places under one of these proposals, which is just totally crazy. The most insane proposal in Arizona or in any other state, though, is a bill that would basically say the legislature can appoint its own presidential electors anytime it wants, no matter how people vote. So like Arizona votes for Biden, like forget it. We don't care. We're just going to appoint our own electors and there's nothing you can do about it. This is exactly what Trump wanted them to do in 2020. And they didn't do it because they didn't have the power to do it. And now they're basically saying the election's meaningless in the state because we can do whatever we want to overturn it. And so I don't think that's going to pass because I think that's just way too crazy. But the fact that it's even on the table is really chilling. And I think the strategy here is just flood the zone with as many crazy ideas as possible. So then you fight the craziest ideas, but then the ones that are slightly less crazy, that's the compromise that is allowed to go through. And that's what I'm concerned about here. Is not that everything's going to pass, although it could, because Republicans are in control of Arizona, just like they're in control of state government in Georgia. It's that there's going to be so many moving targets. It's going to be really, really difficult to defeat all of them.
Pennsylvania, we have a similar dynamic.
Similar dynamic, a little bit different. They've introduced, as of a week ago, 14 bills to make it harder to vote. They want to do things like get rid of no excuse absentee voting, which all but 2 Republicans voted for. They want to get rid of ballot drop boxes. They want to make sure that your ballot has to arrive by election day, not a few days after, even though that's written into Pennsylvania law. A lot of this stuff's not going to pass immediately because they have a Democratic governor that can veto it. What I'm concerned about in Pennsylvania is there might not be a Democratic governor after 2022 because Tom Wolf is term limited. So if a Republican gets in there, they can pass this stuff in time for 2024. There's also this proposal to try to gerrymander the state courts. You might remember it was the Pennsylvania state courts that struck down extreme gerrymandering in Pennsylvania. It was the Pennsylvania Supreme Court that refused to pass all these restrictions on mail voting that Republicans wanted. So now they're saying, we want to redraw the courts. This is, again, one of the craziest proposals I've seen. They want to gerrymander the courts that struck down gerrymandering. And what they want to do is, instead of elections being statewide, so people can run from anywhere in Pennsylvania, they want to draw districts for every state Supreme Court justice, for example, so that they can gerrymander the district so that instead of a Democratic progressive majority on the Supreme Court, there will be a gerrymandered Republican Supreme Court. Then, of course, would be hearing challenges to voter suppression and gerrymandering that would be passed by these legislators.
And we need to make something really clear here. The role of a state Supreme Court justice, or frankly, any judge, is not to be representative of a specific group of people. I mean, it's one thing to have these judges elected by the entire state, but there is absolutely no rationale to have a regional election for these people unless you wanted to fashion that region in such a way that it will always elect a specific type of person to this court. I mean,
of course,
no logic to that whatsoever. I mean, it's one thing to say we need to have state legislature from, my town because we have specific interests about what has to happen in any given place. But there's no logic whatsoever to have Supreme Court justices come from a certain part of the state. That's just absurd, we should say. And we should also say this state Supreme Court struck down the gerrymandering that took place in the congressional districts, but not in the state legislature districts. So you still have that dynamic where in Pennsylvania, more Democrats come out to vote for their state lawmakers, but more Republicans win. That you all have in, let's say, Wisconsin.
Exactly. And that's why a decade after they drew the maps in 2011 in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Michigan and all of these states, Republicans are still in control of the legislature. And I just find it really surprising that Wisconsin would vote for Joe Biden. They would vote to have a Democratic governor. Same with Michigan, same with Pennsylvania. But they're so happy with their Republican legislature. They would leave them in power for an entire decade. It would be the only position in the state to which they would say, we like the Republicans so much, let's keep them in control. The only reason they're still there is because of gerrymandering. It's the only reason they're still in control in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania is because they drew the districts in 2011. It worked perfectly. They're still in power. Now they're going to draw them all over again, although it's going to be a little bit different in those states because there's either Democratic governors or in Michigan, there's going to be an independent redistricting commission. And it's going to be really interesting to see what happens in Michigan, for example, when there are actually fair districts drawn, how the state votes.
Well, I can tell you what's going to happen. It's going to end up going to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court's going to say the state legislature cannot delegate that authority to an independent commission. We're just going to allow the Republicans to redraw the districts. That's my guess anyway.
Yeah, I mean, that would be very ironic because when the Supreme Court said that federal courts can't review partisan gerrymandering in 2018, they expressly said there are other solutions like independent redistricting commission. So it would be Mitch McConnell-esque cynical, which I'm not putting past this current Supreme Court, to say it's kind of like how Mitch McConnell said, let's delay impeachment until after Trump's gone and then we can't impeach him because he's no longer in office. I mean, that is essentially what they'd be doing with independent redistricting commissions if they took that line.
Okay, I got two questions for you to wrap this up. One, I think people heard the story of, and this played out in the Supreme Court census case, but there was a story about a daughter whose dad died, who was a big Republican operative. She found his computer hard drive as she was going through his stuff. They were a little estranged. They had different political philosophies. She found that this guy had written out for the Department of Justice, essentially their alibi to lie about why they need to not have immigrants counted on the census. And this played a big part in that census case. He was also known as like the godfather of Republican sort of gerrymandering and sort of vote suppression strategy down to the very granular demographic level. So you guys are going to be able to eliminate Latino voters here. Are you going to be able to eliminate? How much has his passing away, has that affected anything, or was basically his expertise absorbed into the Republican Borg?
Yeah, I think that's right. Tom Hoffler is his name, and he's passed away. But yeah, I mean, I think there's other people in the Republican Party that know how to gerrymander. And there was just a report out from the Brennan Center for Justice today that I'd urge people to look at, because they're basically saying all of the population growth in states like Texas and Florida and Georgia and North Carolina is coming from people of color. 4 out of 5 new eligible voters are people of color. But Republicans are going to try to draw these maps to maintain white power in the face of these massive demographic changes. And I believe that's the story of American politics right now, writ large, what the Republican Party is doing as the country becomes more diverse. And I think that's why there was a Capitol insurrection in the first place. But I think it's going to be played out at the most granular level in redistricting, because they're going to say, how can we weaken the power of all of these communities that should actually have more power, because they are the future of the country, but instead we're going to give them less power. And so I think that's going to be something to keep an eye on. And I don't think they need Tom Hoffler around to be able to do it. They have other people that can draw these maps. But it's going to be really, really interesting to see what we learn about this process, because they're going to be pursuing the exact same strategy that he pursued. The question is, are we going to be able to do anything about it? And are the courts going to be able to do anything about it? And I think I'm very, very concerned that the 6-3 Supreme Court is going to have either no problems with this or just say we shouldn't get involved at all. Right.
I have a feeling that it's going to be the latter, because when things are going their way, then they stand back. All right. So lastly, you brought up this point earlier. Republicans get into office, the first thing they do is they try and disenfranchise voters that they think aren't going to vote for them. Democrats get into office, they get power. They look at the filibuster. Now, you said like they should get rid of the filibuster, but it's not just for the sake of getting rid of the filibuster, although I think we would both agree that that would make things more democratic, small d. Like you could actually have the party that wins the most votes make the laws. And so us as a voter can determine like, hey, I really don't like it when they get in power because this is what they do, as opposed to sort of say like, oh, we would do this, but we can't because of them. But the real issue here is when the Democrats took control of the House, they passed H.R. 1. Among other things in this about corruption, it was about restoring the Voting Rights Act. It was about increasing the federal right to vote so that it would be harder for states to do these type of things that you've been talking about and you've been reporting on for years. Do you think, have you heard in the course of your reporting when that there is going to be an attempt, obviously, to pass, I think they call it the John Lewis Act at this point. Is that going to be the moment that they use to try and get rid of the filibuster? I mean, give me your sense of how this is going to play out, because that has to happen.
Yeah, I mean, so Democrats have two incredibly important pieces of legislation that could literally save American democracy. The John Lewis Voting Rights Act to restore the Voting Rights Act, and H.R. 1, the People Act, which is the most sweeping democracy reform bill in a generation, and would address all of the things that we are talking about by mandating early voting and automatic registration and independent redistricting and voting rights for people with past felony convictions. I mean, every good thing on voting is in that bill. And the only way they're going to pass them is by eliminating the filibuster or creating an exception to the filibuster for laws that pertain to voting and democracy, because there's no way these bills are going to get 60 Republican votes. Lisa Murkowski is the only Republican that signed on to the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, and not a single Republican has signed on to H.R. 1 or S1 as it's known in the Senate. So, I mean, this is going to be a real thing here. And I think the strategy for the Democrats is let's let the Republicans filibuster this, and people are going to get so angry that they are going to say we can't allow this to happen again. Now, I don't know if that's going to happen. That's a risky strategy. I would like there to be more of a strategy going into it to try to figure out what you do. The key people obviously are Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin. I think Joe Manchin's a tough nut to crack because he's a Democrat from West Virginia. Kyrsten Sinema is a senator from Arizona in a state where they've introduced 34 new voter suppression laws. So I do not think it should be a tough argument for her to say, listen, you want to survive, you want the Democratic Party to survive, you want Mark Kelly to survive. The Republican legislature in Arizona is going to do everything they can to prevent you from winning your next election unless we pass the For the People Act and unless we pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. I think you could make that argument to Joe Manchin too, but I think Kyrsten Sinema from Arizona, one of those states that's targeted by voter suppression, that should at least be an easier argument for her. And then it's just down to Manchin. And then the question is, you're a Democrat. Do you want the Democratic Party to survive as a political institution, or do you want Republicans to be able to entrench power through anti-democratic means for the next decade and beyond? So you're never in the majority. And that's basically the end of it. I mean, so I don't know if that's going to work on Joe Manchin. I don't know what he really cares about. But this is not just about, I mean, it's about two things. It's about small d democracy and whether it survives, but it's also about whether the Democratic Party is going to be able to have power beyond 2 years. And I think it's going to be very, very hard for them to keep power in the House or the Senate if all of these anti-democratic measures that we're talking about go through and the Democrats have no federal response.
I got to say, Joe Manchin is an interesting character in all of this because he seems to posture in certain ways and then ends up voting. I think we'll get a sense of this on the $15 minimum wage, et cetera, but he tends to end up where he lands is really the thing where you got to watch. He likes to do a lot of like loop-de-loops before he gets there, but he generally lands, I think. Well, I guess we'll see, but it would be interesting legacy for Joe Manchin to be the vote that gets a sweeping voting reform into law. Ari Berman, always fascinating stuff. We will link to your piece at Mother Jones and, of course, to your book if people want to understand the fight that was involved in voting rights. Thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Great to talk to you again, Sam. Thanks a lot.